Hi, my name is Gretchen Sabel, and I am the Vice President of the League of Women Voters ABC. And I'm also the Chair of the League of Women Voters Upper Mississippi River Region, and I work on water issues. I'm a retired Pollution Control Agency staffer, 30-some years, and now I do my advocacy through the nonprofit sector. I'm going to be talking tonight about the Minnesota Groundwater Protection Act, which passed in 1989. This was one of the bills that was kind of one of the last big pieces of environmental legislation. So when you think we had the Clean Water Act, we had the Clean Air Act, we had the Safe Drinking Water Act, we had the, those are all federal bills, we had ACCRA, which cleaned up Superfund sites. Minnesota, we had our Groundwater Protection Act that kind of wrapped a lot of things up. And so I'm going to talk about that in this talk. But first, to set the stage, if you spin the clock back to the middle of the last century, so the 50s, 60s, it was a time when Minnesotans were just coming into our own, I guess. Also, that one picture, that was Dayton's, back when Dayton's was still Dayton's, and it was at Southdale, and that was a big deal. So that was in 1960. So when you think about that decade, those 3 decades, 50 through 80, Minnesota's population went from about 3 million to about 4 million. And there was a lot of change in how we lived. Minnesota had been largely a rural agricultural state up until that time, but as the soldiers came back from World War II, the complexion of our state changed and people changed how they lived. And so when you think about it, there was profound changes in farming practices too. There was tractors replaced horses. I mean, that was a new thing in the 50s. The peak year of tractor sales in the U.S. was 1952. You know why? Because there'd been lots and lots of farms, little farms, and they all got tractors, and then they got bigger. And then there was fewer farms. And so the maximum number of tractors sold was in 52. And farming practices changed. Once they were mechanized, then they were able to use more chemical fertilizers, more pesticides, and farms got larger. So it really changed how farming worked. And there was changes in where we lived. The suburb there on the left, that is Roseville, with dirt streets in 1952. The corner that you see there, that intersection, that's Lexington and Larpenteur in 1953. And all this development happened without sewer and water. So these people moved onto these little lots. Everybody had their own cesspool, their own well, and they were kind of moving out into areas like out here in Andover where we had all these junkyards and tire dumps and things like that. And so you kind of saw people moving out into contaminated areas. And so what happened, you guys all heard of Love Canal. Love Canal didn't happen here, but we had our own many versions of that. So the picture on the left here, this shows, it's not Love Canal, but it's kind of a generic EPA stock photo of barrels. But the one on the right is right here in Andover, Waste Disposal Engineering. And Waste Disposal Engineering took a large number of hazardous wastes. And so they are actually going to be doing a cleanup here this summer, I believe, where they're going to be removing all the material in the hazardous waste pit because it's just been a continued source of contamination that hasn't been able to be cleaned up. So this is, it's stuff that as the world changed, we used more chemicals. As we used more chemicals, we had to get rid of them, and we didn't know how to do that very well, and so we ended up with problems. And so that's what kind of led to all this. So, like I said, CERCLA, the U.S. Superfund Act, passed in 1980. The Minnesota response to that passed in 83. And that act addressed big kind of problems, the landfills and things like that. But there was all kinds of smaller problems all around, plus what they call non-point sources, things that are kind of everyday activities that were contaminating groundwater. And it just kept on happening. So there was awareness of widespread groundwater problems, and Minnesota agencies were empowered to develop a strategy to help address the problem. So that kind of mustard-colored one, it was a groundwater protection framework from 1983. The one that has the state map is 1989, the protection strategy. There was a wise use of pesticide strategy, the blue one that's there. There was also the state water plan from 79 and 85, the groundwater protection strategy issue team report. So lots of stuff was coming forward. And at the same time, and I will say, just a little side benefit for leaguers, many leaguers were involved in doing these. Every time there was a citizen committee, you saw the league represented in these. So water issues has been something league's been working on for years. Anyhow, so all this came together, and there was all this stuff, and there was the the understanding that there needed to be new laws, and then that was compounded by the drought. And so you can see there the brown, or whatever that maroon dark color is, that was the drought in 1989. And, you know, with that much drought, or 88 drought. And so everybody was thinking about water. And that really helped to give impetus to passing this bill. So in the 1989 Groundwater Protection Act, there was a bill in the House, there was a bill in the Senate. They were very different. The House bill was like the governor liked, the Senate bill was something else. It was 30 hours of conference committees, 30 hours of conference committees to resolve that, which was quite a thing. Senator Steve Morse had been the chief author of that. He's now former Senator Steve Morse and the head of the Minnesota Environmental Partnership. But he said that Minnesota legislators were concerned about widespread incidents of pesticides in groundwater and the growing evidence that it was everyday activities of Minnesotans that was causing contamination. And he felt that legislators understood that they had a duty to protect groundwater for future generations. And so that was what led to the impetus for that. So some caveats. I'm not a historian, but this is my sources. I dug through my dusty old closet in my husband's office and found all the old books that I had. There's still online resources where things have made the jump into the digital age from the 80s. I contacted a friend that woman that I said, Linda Bremer, had testified at the U.S. Congress in Washington about the Groundwater Protection Act. And when I contacted her for resources or a statement, she said, I just put it in a recycle bin, let me get it out. And she pulled out from her recycle bin her testimony to Congress. And then that picture there, that was me from the early 90s standing next to an early groundwater protection map. And so, you know, I kind of dug through stuff. And then this is still in the news. I mean, we are still fighting these battles now as we try to implement this act going into the 2020s. And so this is me and Senator Morse actually testifying on this April 16th, so a month ago. We testified on implementing this bill. So that's kind of my background. It's kind of like a personal thing, and it's some stuff I found. So the Groundwater Protection Act was something that, for the first time in statute, put into statute a goal for groundwater protection. And that's something that we didn't have before. When you have a contaminated site and you're cleaning up the water, you have to know how clean you have to get it. And so you can do things to clean it up, and you can take out a lot of pollutants, you know, with this much effort, but to get the last bit takes a whole lot more effort, you know, and so that last bit is hard, and so they wanted to set limits for cleanups. And the limits for cleanups would be safe levels, and that's good, but you don't want to let the water get to those limits in non-contaminated areas. And so how do you have something that protects groundwater that isn't already contaminated? So what we got in statute now is this goal that the groundwater be protected in its natural state to the extent that we can. And where it can't be, we're going to try to come up with means to do that. And that was the first time that was in statute. It applies to all groundwater too. So there was a thought in those 80s decades that we don't really mean the water under our septic systems, do we? Or we don't really mean the water under cornfields, do we? And this statute says, yes, we do. We mean all that water, and that we need to work hard to make all that water better. And so that was a big step forward in this bill. Willard Munger was one of the bill authors, and he was a really good guy, and he carried the ball on this in the House, and this was one of his causes, but Steve Morse was really the most eloquent on it, so I appreciated the work that they did. This is an early groundwater sensitivity map. This was where we were kind of in '89, and you can see there, you can see our area here in Anoka County is red. Why is that? Because we have all this sandy soil, and that means that our area is more susceptible to contamination than other parts of the state. And so with the Groundwater Protection Act in '89, DNR was to develop criteria for actually identifying this in a better way and kind of coming up with more consistent criteria. This map was put together by the Pollution Control Agency, and what we had was just kind of some limited data, and we did the best we could, and it was flawed. And so money went to DNR to do that, and also the atlases that we've talked about here before. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to go back and forth between what the law did and how it's implemented today. So this map that you see here, this is the current groundwater sensitivity map that DNR has done. And it's not just a picture, it is GIS layers that cities can download. The data goes into the county atlases and things like that. And it's also used in planning decisions, it's used in lots of things. And so it's really grown from the static map that was in that picture, which was actually at a very gross scale, to a very detailed, fine-scale map that can be used and is used today. And it's part of a growing body of data. The county atlases, so Anoka County, we just got our atlas pretty quick ago, and we were part of the wave of county atlases. The diagram there on the right shows funding for county atlases, and so there was a recognition with the Groundwater Act that we needed to do more atlases, but the money wasn't really there until the Legacy Act passed. And once we had that sales tax dedication, then a lot of money went into funding these atlases, and a lot more has been done. So that's been good. Jan Faltasek was the person at Department of DNR who worked on these quite a bit, and she said that these county atlases really tie together surface and groundwater and provide detailed evaluation for local decision makers. And so we've seen that here in Anoka County, and it's happening around the state. Another thing, and this is kind of arcane, but when I was talking about limits, so there's limits at the federal level for public water supplies. And so when they test public water supplies, those of you on public water, you might get a notice that your water is too high on radium. I think Andover's problem is radium. And other cities might have other kinds of problems. And so they have to test and measure, and if there's a problem, they have to let you know, and then try to fix it. But there wasn't anything for people with private wells. And so as the state tested more private wells, they would find things, and you might think that you could apply those levels from the federal government for public water supplies, but those levels for public water supplies were set based on treatability, cost benefit, and things like that, things that don't apply to your private well, because your private well, you just suck it up and use it. And so you had to come up with a whole different kind of an equation for that. And so the way this act addressed that was to have these health risk limits developed by Department of Health. And the health risk limits would be a tool for private water supplies. It advises public water suppliers for things that don't have limits, and the federal government takes them a while to set a limit, and so the state can do that more quickly through this process. And it's based on compounds detected in water. And it's kind of a process that's set up in a back and forth way. So the Pollution Control Agency does monitoring. They find chemical X. They say, Department of Health, we need standards for chemical X, and the Department of Health does that. And the same thing, Department of Ag. Department of Ag finds pesticides. They say, we need a standard for that so we can evaluate safety. And so that's kind of a back and forth of how that works. And how this has been implemented today then. The first rule was promulgated in '93, and now every 5 years it comes out, so we're due for another one here. And it's also, so it's not just Pollution Control Agency and Ag Department now that can request these limits be set, the public can also request that. And so that's something new. This is an example of the limits that they have, and you can see that it's based on, they explain what the limit's based on, what the rationale for it is and stuff. So we really get a lot of information about that. Looking at how this has been implemented, we're going to talk about atrazine. Atrazine is a chemical used on corn crops. It's used on about 25% of the corn grown in Minnesota. It is Department of Ag monitors groundwater, springs, and something else. Wells. Well, groundwater, yeah. Wells and springs. So they monitor groundwater. This is the 2016 map. There was 248 points that they monitor. And they found atrazine in about 25% of these at very low levels. And so is this a concern? Do we have to change how we use atrazine is the question. And so what happened was the Department of Health did an atrazine risk assessment, and they came out with their human health assessment, and they said, this is the number. And then Department of Ag reviewed how atrazine is used, and they determined that we don't need to make changes today in how we use atrazine, but we're going to continue to monitor it. And then they also said that there's additional work being done by the federal government that could change how we address this number. And so if that number might change, they might change their process. But then when I clicked off to the page at EPA's website, you can see that this is a page that EPA no longer maintains. So we're not sure where the current administration is going with that. But anyhow, that's kind of how it works. And it was meant to have that backdrop of the federal government and federal research. And then, so once you identified a problem, you've measured it, you've found a problem, okay, now how do we make a change? And that question of how you make a change is what's coming up now. And so this law, this new bill, set out a process, and I'll talk more about this process, but basically where the problem is coming from, kind of ongoing, daily, very widespread activities like farming, how do you address that? And so we're going to have a two-step process of best management practices. So the best management practices would be developed by Department of Ag for ag chemicals, the Pollution Control Agency for other land uses, and then these would be voluntary measures. And what it says is that we're going to tell you the best way to do this, and you need to do those things. And then if that's not effective, then you move to the water resource protection requirements, which we affectionately call WIPRs. And these would be implemented, they're not voluntary anymore. So it basically takes it to that next level. And it includes liability protection for people. So if you're actually following it and still wells are contaminated, that gets you off the hook as the polluter because you're doing what you were told to do. This is, remember those dusty old books in my husband's dusty closet? This was back when recycled paper was still gray. So the picture of this, this diagram. But basically what it shows is that as the amount of contaminants found in water increase, we're going to step up what we do. So basically before anything's detected, the furthest left, you're going to be educating, you're going to be talking to people about what BMPs are. At the next level, when you start to detect it, you really start to push the BMPs, you're going to be doing more promotion and things like that. The next step is to go to these WIPRs. And so after you've been doing all this voluntary promotion and measuring still, if it's not effective, then you're going to go to these mandatory measures. And that's where we got hung up today in the nitrogen rule. And I'll talk more about that in a couple minutes, but that's kind of how it is. And then the last level is don't drink the water and call in the National Guard with the tankers. And so, it's kind of set up as this stepwise process that has been being followed. How many years has it been since 1989? We have been working with best management practices for things, and we've been finding nitrogen levels increasing in groundwater around the state. And so we know that the best management practices aren't doing the job. And so the Department of Ag put together a nitrogen fertilizer management plan in 2015 that said, we're going to go to WIPRs, we're going to go to water resource protection requirements. They proposed a rule in June of 2017 that laid out very similar to that other diagram I had. This is the kind of activities we're going to do when we have low nitrogen, and it increases as nitrogen increases. And then they had separate levels for in public water supplies and in private water supplies in their proposed rule. Well, they got lots and lots of public comment, thousands of people replied, and they proposed a rule that then the legislature didn't like. And the legislature is trying to pass a bill that would take away their authority to require water resource protection requirements. And so that's what Steve Morse and I were testifying against, and that's what we would like to see the governor veto if it makes it to his desk. He has said he would, but as we know, if it comes in an omnibus bill, then those are tough choices. And so I'm working with the Minnesota Environmental Partnership, and so is Isaac Walton and others to see that that doesn't happen, but there's no guarantees. So anyhow, so that's where it is. As part of AG's fallback, they had to change their rule to not address public wells or private wells anymore, just public wells. And so all they're trying to do, that the legislature won't let them do, is to say that if you're in the water supply area for a public water supply well, and that public water supply well is over the limits with nitrogen, then you need to do different practices in your area. And they're not allowed to do that. So I think that's egregious, but I guess I'm allowed to have opinions. Anyhow, other things that this bill did, it established the Legislative Water Commission, because the thought was that if you had a core of legislators with deeper knowledge on water, that they would be able to react better. It was bipartisan. It was disbanded and then reformed, and so now it's going again. And there was lots of stuff that went on with monitoring and data. People assume that because the Department of Health does these things, and the Department of Ag does these things, and the Department of PCA does these things, and DNR does these things, that nobody talks and nobody's consistent, and this data just stays in this pile, and this data just stays in this pile. Well, the Groundwater Protection Act required consistent data standards and pooling of data, and so now that's all together, and in Minnesota you can find that data, and so that's been a good thing, data compatibility guidelines. So that's been implemented. And then pesticides. Remember we had that pesticide, the wise use of pesticides report? So pesticides was a big focus of this because it was alarming to people to see atrazine and metallochlor and all these compounds showing up in public water supplies. And so they require, there's a lot more monitoring now that goes on. The Department of Ag developed a pesticide management plan that address storage, handling, distribution, and disposal. So it's not just the on-land distribution, but the storage and that kind of thing. They now have a waste pesticide container collection system, so it doesn't just get disposed on the farm and drippy. Chemigation. Chemigation is where you install, have a irrigation system and you put chemicals out through the irrigation system. And so they tightened up the requirements for that. And so there's a lot of stuff that happened relative to pesticides. They also formed something called ACCRA, and that's an acronym for the Agricultural Chemical something response. Yeah, there you go. And what it is, it's like a Superfund for pesticide sites. And so pesticide fees go into this, and if there's a spill at a pesticide blender, they can draw on that money to fix the problem. And so that was something new with this. And then also the administration of Superfund was shifted from PCA Department of Finance, and so MDA could participate in Superfund stuff as well if needed. One of the people that I contacted for comments was Dan Stoddard, who had been just a lowly staff person back when this was passed, and now he's the assistant director of a division at Ag. And he said that the Groundwater Protection Act was a great success for adjusting pesticides, both for point and non-point, primarily because it was funded, and so that's a key. And when there's enough money to do it, it happens. And the high concentration in city wells has been coming down, and because they've been able to address these blending sites and things like that. So that's been good. This is an ag chemical facility. ACCRA was actually one of the only ones in the country that deals with waste pesticide cleanups. And it strengthened the bulk storage requirements too. The rules for above ground storage were somewhat lax, and they were strengthened as part of this act. On the water well side, so private water wells in 1974, the well code was passed and had to be followed. Licensing of water well contractors happened in the '89 Act, along with new fees on private water wells that funded the program at the Department of Health. And there was also a lot of other kinds of wells out there, monitoring wells, observation wells, dewatering wells. And so like when you see pumps running along a roadside construction, they're actually pulling water out. Well, how do those wells get managed? And so all those things happened to tighten up the requirements so that we didn't have conduits for contamination where the wells are. If you have your well and it's contaminated and you know who did it, you can sue the polluter. That was a new feature of this bill. And they also established an advisory council on wells and borings. So those of you that know Roger Renner, he does a lot of well drilling in our area. He was the chair of that for a while. So Anoka County has been well represented. The other thing that we talk a lot about with wells is well sealing. And so if you have a well that you're not using anymore, what you should do is fill it up with cement so that it can't be a conduit for surface contaminants to go down. And if you have a shallow well, that's not too expensive. And if you have a big, deep well, it's a lot more expensive. And so there's been grants available and a lot of work to get people to seal these. There's still thousands of unsealed wells in the state. We've sealed thousands as well. And so this is a continuing effort, and you'll always hear about it in the Board of Water and Soil Resources when they talk about their grants. It's always things like that. The other thing that happened is that now when you sell your property, you have to say, I have a well on my property and it's here, and there's also another well there and there and there. Because a lot of times, I know the house that we had in Brooklyn Center actually had a whole forest of sand pipes sticking out of the basement floor as they tried to get water before city water came to them. And so those things need to be managed appropriately. And with this disclosure, you have to say, I have a well and it's here, and you have to let people know about that. And if you lie, then you are liable. So that was a big change too. And then water conservation. I didn't talk about this. DNR had been measuring declines in the water levels in the big aquifers under the Twin Cities. So water, in the Twin Cities, we have so much water. We don't even think about how much water we have. But there's a number of aquifers stacked up on each other. And one of the deepest here that's used for water supply is the Mount Simon. And it's old water, tens of thousands of years old. And buildings in St. Paul and Minneapolis were pumping it up, running it through one-time cooling systems, and then discharging it to the river. And so what was happening was the water was coming up and going to the river, and the water level in that aquifer was dropping. And so to address that, they made some changes. They phased out, once through cooling, no new permits and phasing out. And that, you can see there, they increased the fees. So the fees increased on that until it was phased out. They also increased the water use fees. You probably heard about this law relative to White Bear Lake, because as White Bear Lake has been having its water level issues, they're pointing the finger at DNR for not doing good management. And, so DNR has been tightening up more, but before this act, they didn't even have tools to do that. So it's been kind of a continuing saga of where we're going. And now DNR has new tools to assist water suppliers. So the problem that they found at White Bear Lake was actually that all the cities around pumping lowered the water table enough, and White Bear Lake is a leaky lake. It reflects the water table level, and so as the water table dropped, so did the lake level. And so DNR has these new tools to assist water suppliers in assessing how much is used, how much is wasted, how much you have going to leaky pipes, how much is used in irrigation in the summer, because that's a big, it's like usually 3 times more in the summer than in the winter. And so what can you do to reduce that? So those are kinds of tools that are being developed as well. So when you think about all that, it's like a lot of money to go into all this. Where did that come from? And this is something that we probably wouldn't see today either. You could see that the money came from water use fees, water permit fees, pesticide fees, but half of it was from the general fund. Oh, yeah, those were the days, huh? And then it went out pretty balanced between money to local governments, money for research, money for implementation of pollution control stuff, and money for monitoring. So the money coming in and the money going out was nicely balanced. It was about $17 million for the biennium, though, so that's a lot of money. And it actually resulted in a lot of state employees, too. 106 new employees came as a result of this act, a lot of them in the health department. Oh, I didn't talk about that. The Clean Water Act required the state to do all kinds of stuff to implement the Federal Clean Water Act. And before this act passed, we didn't have the tools or the resources to do that. And so this bill, while there wasn't language in the bill, there was money in the bill to implement the Clean Water Act. And so that's been a lot of the changes that we've seen on the public water supply level. So, in conclusion, this was a sweeping piece of legislation that changed groundwater regulation in Minnesota and is still controversial. It addressed a non-degradation goal. It gave us a mechanism for addressing non-point sources. It increased conservation, allowed us to implement the Clean Water Act, and improved data and information management. And it also increased cooperation among water agencies. So that was a big side benefit. And so with that, I'll take questions, and we don't have to do cards. We can just ask questions. I will repeat the questions. Anybody have a question? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where are we in terms of availability of water for local?
Okay, so the question is, where are we with the availability of water for local use? And she cited the issues in Ramsey. I said there's a lot of water in the Twin Cities area, but it's actually like a bowl-shaped depression, and up here in Andover, we're on the edge of that, and Ramsey's kind of beyond that, and so you have different kinds of geology in Ramsey than we have here. Ramsey usually, I believe, uses more superficial sand and gravel aquifers, which are just limited in what they can provide. And so as Ramsey grows, DNR said, you might want to think about the river, since it's right here, but when you treat water from the river, it's really expensive. So you think about that big water plant that Minneapolis has, Ramsey would have to do something like that to treat the water. And then you still have supply issues at some time. But anyhow, so they're looking at that. DNR has actually set up a number of groundwater management areas and studies. And so this area is part of, I don't remember the name of this one, but they're kind of getting cities in this area to work on it. I know Elk River was having some similar issues, and so they'd like to see two cities, not in the same county, working together on it. I don't know about Dayton and Champlin, but as growth happens, it's just difficult for cities to meet the need. Right. Yeah, the point is that we have laws that address pesticides, and we've been pretty effective with pesticides and pretty effective with other kinds of chemicals. But when it comes to everyday pollutants like nitrogen and phosphorus, we don't know how to deal with those because they're so ubiquitous and they're so, like Pogo said, we've seen the problem and it's us. And so everything that we do creates that. And so we do need better laws, and we also need better enforcement of laws. The flap that we're having right now about the nitrogen rule at the Department of Ag kind of points that up, because we need to have a way to be able to say, no, you need to do these things in this area. We can't just talk about it anymore, because what you're doing here is affecting thousands of people. Lonnie brought that up, and she's from the city of Adrian, and Adrian's spending beaucoup bucks to treat their water to reduce nitrogen down there in southwest Minnesota. And so there's a lot of concerns with that. Yeah, Marcia. Mm-hmm. Yep. There's money for monitoring water. So we can monitor water. When it comes to monitoring practices, it's a little tougher. And Department of Ag does that. And because of the kinds of privacy rules that they have through USDA, they can't report things. And so it's a little difficult. Well, and that's what this thing at the legislature is about, is trying to get it to have teeth. We'd like to be able to have a tool that says you need to do it different. And it's not a no to farming. It's a no to farming like you are right now, because that's obviously not working. It's a you need to change thing. So, and maybe part of it would be putting your land into CRP or some other kind of thing, CRP conservation reserve, where instead of growing crops, you grow prairie grass. And the federal government pays you to grow prairie grass. So, that kind of thing. Yeah, Marcia. Mm-hmm. So the question was, has there been a positive result from the buffers? And I can't say. Is Mary Jo still here? Do you know Mary Jo? Do you have anything? Yeah. Yeah, Mary Jo is with Anoka Conservation District, and she said that she doesn't believe that there's any data yet, and I don't know of any yet either. So, but it's new and it's changing. Jerry? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. On what? Okay, so the question is, how are we doing on recharge? So recharge is when surface water trickles down into the ground to become groundwater, and that's how groundwater comes. And so some things that I didn't talk about here are the stormwater program. And the stormwater program in Minnesota required cities to spin back the clock to 1977. And so all new development has to manage water on site. And so that's why you see what people call those ugly ponds in all new developments, but that's a groundwater recharge. And there's problems with that. I mean, you know, you're getting water in there, but it's water with what? And so that's changing. But you see that in development. So part of the problem with recharge was when you have too much impervious surface, you don't get recharge. And so now we're having recharge, but it's recharge that maybe you don't want. And so we still have to work on that. I don't know of any recharge projects, but it could be something. Elk River at one point was looking at storing water underground. So, you know, they treat the water in the wintertime, keep up the levels, and then they store it underground and use it in the summer when demand is higher. But they didn't get very far with that. Kay was first. No. Minnesota is not limited by the federal government in groundwater management because the federal government only addresses like safe drinking water. And so they have standards for safe drinking water, but they don't do any kind of groundwater management stuff. They deal with waters of the U.S., which is navigable waters, and groundwater ain't. So it's ours. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, they are. Mm-hmm. They are, but they aren't, you know, because we all kind of, you know, you all go, well, what are we going to do? Well, what's Wisconsin doing? And so, so there's that kind of, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So Susan's question relates to this Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit against 3 counties up in, so City of Des Moines gets its water from the Raccoon River, and up at the headwaters of that river, there were 3 counties that Des Moines said weren't doing their job of managing drainage, and so too much nitrogen was coming into the river, and the City of Des Moines had to spend millions of dollars to treat the water. So they brought a lawsuit, and the Iowa Supreme Court ruled that the laws in Iowa protect agriculture to a level that that lawsuit can't happen. And so it was, whatever the word is for that, tossed out. Yeah. Right. No. You know, that's why I started back in history, because all these problems, it was us. It was all stuff that we did. Some of the biggest problems in the Twin Cities came during the war when we were focused on producing. And so like the Twin Cities arsenal that brought down the water supplies of how many cities downstream was because we were needing to make shells and bullets there at the arsenal at 10 and 35. So, yeah, Roger. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So Roger's question was, which is a bigger impactor on groundwater levels? Is it agriculture, irrigation, or is it municipal supply? There's an area in like the Morrison, Benton County area. So when you're driving on Highway 10 north of the Twin Cities, you go past St. Cloud, and before you get to Little Falls is Little Rock Creek. And the Little Rock Creek watershed has those problems. It has both growing municipal use and agriculture. And so they're trying to weigh those and determine which is the bigger problem. And that's one of those DNR study areas. I will make a plug for the Upper Mississippi River Region's website because we do have a blog post on that one. And so what we do, if anybody wants to get our newsletter, I could just sign you all up today. And in our blog, what we usually do is write on some issue. And so we've had blog articles on the Des Moines Water Works and on the Little Rock Creek. There's other parts of Minnesota that have those same kind of problems. I'll get you, Sandy. And so like up in the Park Rapids area, there it's all agriculture. And that's the problem. Because groundwater isn't a single thing. Groundwater is a very local kind of problem. And so there isn't a single answer to which one is more here and there. Or everywhere. It's what's more here and what's more there. Yes, Sandy? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. There's actually in law a water use, the question was, is there kind of a balancing of home irrigation versus agriculture irrigation? Because at least agriculture is growing food and lawn irrigation is growing grass. And there is a hierarchy set up in law that says that domestic consumption is top priority and others in agriculture is further down. And I know that some cities, not necessarily here, but like Maplewood, they require when you have a new commercial building that you have a separate water meter for your irrigation, and they can require you to turn that off when the time comes. And so I think that would be a way for the future too. But everybody recognizes the need to have more conservation now, and that's what we're trying to push. Right. So some things about lawn watering, yeah. So for lawn watering, there's a number of things that I know of, probably a lot more going on. One of them is something that the University of Minnesota turfgrass people are working on, and it's healthy ways to maintain your lawn. And so they're trying to get the word out on things like don't water daily, because that just makes your lawn sick. The grass gets used to having water all the time, and so it just has little bitty short roots. So if you let it get long, the part under the ground is proportional to the part up. And so if you have longer grass, you get better roots and more resilient lawn. And so they have those kinds of things, better fertilizer practices, better ways to keep your lawn healthy so that you don't need to water so much. So U of M's working on that. Cities, have the odd even watering ban and things like that as well. And I know that cities penalize people for doing that. And otherwise, it's education and voluntary efforts at this point. I think that if we were in another drought like in '88, you would see a lot more restrictions coming on, but because we're as we are, we don't need to do that. Marcia, did you have something? Okay. So I am not seeing any more hands, so thank you all for... Oh, Melanie has something. You can't clap yet. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they're being taxed.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're not communicating with them,
Yeah.
so I think you're going to see
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lonnie's point is that it's going to take a lot of money to change farming practices. I will say, though, that some of the money that we're putting into crop subsidies could be better spent. And so it could be that we change the way we spend the money we're spending, too, as part of that. Yes. Yes, it is. That it is, yes. The Farm Bill is grinding through right now at the national level, and we are working on that in the Upper Mississippi River Region's action work. And so if you want to be part of that, you can certainly join us in that work. And so thank you all.